The smell of my stepmother's expensive perfume hit me before I even reached the front door of the Hillcrest estate. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the golden glow of crystal chandeliers illuminating what had to be at least 60 guests gathered for Dad's 70th birthday celebration. The same sprawling mansion where I'd grown up, where I'd taken my first steps across those marble floors, where I'd built countless childhood memories before everything changed. It had been 3 years since I was last invited to a family gathering. 3 years since my stepmother, Patricia, made it crystal clear that my financial struggles were an embarrassment to the family name. 3 years since she told me I couldn't afford to keep up with their lifestyle and suggested I focus on getting my life together before showing my face at family events again. Tonight, I wasn't returning as Maya Rodriguez, the struggling graphic designer who got laid off and had to move back in with roommates. I was returning as the silent owner of not just this estate, but the entire Hillcrest property development that had made my family their fortune. They just had no idea the deed had my name on it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me as I adjusted the sleeve of my understated black dress. Nothing flashy or designer, just classic and well-tailored. I'd learned that true wealth whispers while insecurity shouts, and tonight I planned to speak very softly until the moment came to be heard. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant, Marcus. "Everything's ready for tomorrow if needed. The lawyers have all the documentation prepared." I smiled, slipping the phone back into my clutch. Tomorrow. If things went according to plan, there wouldn't need to be a tomorrow for this charade. The valet took my keys to the modest Honda Civic I'd deliberately driven tonight. Let them see exactly what they expected to see. Through the windows, I caught glimpses of my half-siblings, Jennifer and David, both in their designer outfits, probably discussing their latest luxury purchases or vacation plans. My father, distinguished and silver-haired, held court near the grand piano, surrounded by family friends and business associates who hung on his every word about real estate investments and market opportunities. And there, gliding between guests like she owned the place, was Patricia in her signature emerald green, diamonds catching the light as she gestured dramatically while telling some story that had everyone laughing. The heavy oak door opened before I could ring the bell. Patricia's smile froze the moment she saw me, her perfectly contoured face shifting from hostess charm to barely concealed irritation in milliseconds. "Maya," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she reserved for discussing unpleasant topics. "I wasn't expecting you tonight." "Hello, Patricia. Happy birthday to Dad. I brought a gift." I held up the small, elegantly wrapped box in my hands. Nothing too expensive looking, just thoughtful and appropriate. The kind of gift someone with limited means might bring. She glanced at the box, then back at my face, clearly calculating whether to make a scene at the front door or deal with this inside. "Of course. Well, come in then. Though I should mention we're having a more intimate gathering tonight. Mostly family and close business associates." The implication was clear. I didn't belong in either category, despite being Dad's biological daughter. I'd heard this song before, the subtle ways she'd create categories that excluded me while making it sound reasonable, even caring. As if she was protecting me from embarrassment rather than protecting herself from what she saw as my embarrassing presence. I stepped into the foyer, my heels clicking against the familiar marble that I'd slid across in socks as a kid. The house looked exactly the same, yet somehow smaller than I remembered. Maybe success changes your perspective on everything, including the spaces that once seemed impossibly grand. The chatter and laughter from the main living area drew us forward, and I could feel Patricia's reluctance with every step. "Robert," she called out in her sing-song voice as we approached the crowd. "Look who decided to join us tonight." Dad turned from his conversation, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure when he saw me. Whatever else had changed in our family dynamics over the years, his love for me had never wavered. even when he'd been too weak to stand up to Patricia's social calculations. "Maya, sweetheart, you made it." He moved toward me with arms outstretched, and for a moment, the background noise of the party faded as he pulled me into one of his bear hugs that had always made everything feel safe. "Happy birthday, Dad. 70 looks good on you." I meant it. Despite everything, despite the ways Patricia had slowly poisoned family dynamics and created distance between us, I still loved this man who'd raised me, who'd taught me about integrity and hard work, even if he'd forgotten some of those lessons along the way. "Thank you for coming, honey. I was hoping you'd make it tonight." There was something in his voice, a warmth that suggested he'd specifically wanted me here, maybe even against Patricia's preferences. Jennifer appeared at his elbow, resplendent, in what had to be $1,000 cocktail dress, her blonde hair perfectly styled in loose waves that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Maya, what a surprise. We weren't sure you'd be able to make it tonight." Her tone was friendly enough on the surface, but I caught the subtle emphasis on able, as if my attendance was a question of capability rather than invitation. "Wouldn't miss Dad's birthday," I replied simply, handing him the wrapped gift. "Just a little something I thought you'd enjoy." David joined our small circle, drink in hand, looking every inch the successful young executive in his perfectly tailored suit. He worked in finance now, something Patricia never failed to mention when discussing her children's accomplishments. "Maya, good to see you. How's the design work going?" The pause before design work spoke volumes, as if he couldn't quite remember what I did for a living, or as if it wasn't important enough to stick in his memory. "Things are going really well, actually. I've been working on some interesting projects lately." I kept my answer deliberately vague. The truth was, I hadn't done freelance graphic design in over 2 years. My portfolio company, Rodriguez Holdings, had acquired enough properties and investments to generate more monthly passive income than David's salary. But tonight wasn't about revealing that particular truth. Not yet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Patricia materialized beside us with the efficiency of a hostess who'd been monitoring this conversation from across the room. "That's wonderful, dear. It's so important to stay busy, to keep trying." The word trying hung in the air like a small insult wrapped in encouragement. Jennifer was just telling us about the promotion she got at the marketing firm. Senior vice president now. And David closed that huge acquisition deal for his company last month. The comparison was subtle but unmistakably clear. Here were her successful children, climbing corporate ladders and earning impressive titles, while I was still trying with my little design work. I nodded and smiled, making appropriate congratulatory sounds while mentally calculating that the passive income from just one of my apartment buildings probably exceeded both their annual salaries combined. "That's fantastic. You should both be really proud of what you've accomplished." And I meant it. Success wasn't a competition, and their achievements didn't diminish my own. The difference was, they needed everyone to know about their success, to feel validated, while I'd learned the power of letting results speak quietly. Dad opened my gift as the conversation continued around us, his face breaking into a genuine smile when he saw the vintage compass inside, engraved with coordinates. That marked the location where he'd first taught me about real estate during a father-daughter trip when I was 12. "Maya, this is perfect. The coordinates from Riverside Park where we walked through that old neighborhood and you asked me how buildings get built. I remember you saying that land was the one thing they weren't making any more of, and that understanding property was understanding the foundation of wealth." The memory was crystal clear, sitting on that park bench while he explained concepts that most 12-year-olds wouldn't grasp, but somehow made perfect sense to me even then. "She always was the thoughtful one," Dad said, his voice carrying a hint of something that might have been regret. "Always paying attention to the details others missed." Patricia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Compliments directed at me had a way of doing that to her, as if kindness was a finite resource that got depleted when shared with the wrong people. Speaking of details, Robert, the Hendersons were asking about the new development project. They're very interested in the Westfield acquisition. The conversation pivoted smoothly toward business, the comfortable territory where Patricia felt most confident guiding discussions. I listened as Dad described the latest property development deal, a massive project that would transform an old industrial area into luxury condominiums and retail space. The numbers he mentioned were impressive, the profit projections even more so. The initial investment was substantial, he was explaining to a small group that had gathered around us. But the location is everything in real estate. Prime spot, perfect timing, and we got it for a fraction of what it'll be worth in 2 years. I sipped the wine someone had handed me, a nice vintage that probably cost more per bottle than many people spent on groceries in a week. The Westfield project he was describing so enthusiastically was indeed a smart investment. I should know, since my holding company had been the silent partner that provided 60% of the funding. Rodriguez Holdings had structured the deal, through enough legal layers that Dad's company appeared to be the primary investor, maintaining his reputation in the industry while I remained completely anonymous. Jennifer was asking about the timeline for the project, and Dad launched into details about zoning approvals and construction phases. His passion for real estate had always been infectious, part of what had drawn me to understand property and investment from such a young age. Even when Patricia's influence had created distance between us, I'd continued to study and learn about the business that had shaped our family's fortune. The beauty of this project, Dad continued, is the anchor tenant we secured. High-end fitness center, very exclusive membership, guaranteed to attract exactly the demographic we want for the residential units. That alone will drive property values up 30% minimum. David nodded knowingly. Smart move, Dad. Anchor tenants make all the difference in mixed-use developments. I bit back a smile. The anchor tenant they were praising so enthusiastically was a premium yoga and wellness studio that I'd personally recruited and whose lease I'd personally guaranteed through another shell company. Every detail of this project that they were celebrating had been carefully orchestrated from behind the scenes, my capital and my connections making their success possible while they remained blissfully unaware of my involvement. Maya, you're being awfully quiet, Patricia observed, her tone carrying just enough concern to sound caring while drawing attention to my lack of contribution to the business discussion. I'm sure all this real estate talk must be a bit over your head. The assumption stung, not because it was insulting, but because it revealed how completely she'd dismissed me as irrelevant to the family's business interests. In her mind, I was still the struggling artist who couldn't possibly understand sophisticated financial concepts, someone to be tolerated at family gatherings, but not included in serious conversations. I find it interesting, I replied carefully. Dad always said real estate was about understanding people as much as understanding property. You have to know what people want before they know they want it. Dad's eyes lit up with recognition. Exactly right. That's the key insight most developers miss. They build what they think people should want instead of what people actually need. Well, that's all very philosophical, Patricia interjected with a light laugh. But at the end of the day, it comes down to having the capital to execute on opportunities. Vision is nice, but money makes things happen. The irony was so perfect it took all my self-control not to laugh out loud. Money makes things happen, she said, completely unaware that my money had been making their biggest opportunity happen for the past 18 months. Instead, I nodded thoughtfully, as if absorbing this wisdom from someone who clearly understood business better than I ever could. The evening continued with more of the same subtle dynamics, Patricia orchestrating conversations that highlighted her children's successes while treating me like a beloved but ultimately irrelevant family member. Dad occasionally trying to include me more directly, only to be smoothly redirected by Patricia toward topics she deemed more appropriate. Other family members and friends being polite, but clearly taking their cues from Patricia about how much attention and respect I deserved. I played my part perfectly, the grateful daughter who was just happy to be included, asking appropriate questions and showing suitable admiration for everyone else's accomplishments. Inside, I was calculating and observing, noting every slight, and every assumption, every moment when they revealed how completely they'd underestimated me. Around 10 o'clock, as the party was beginning to wind down and some guests were making their exit preparations, Patricia cornered me near the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been planning this conversation all evening. "Maya, sweetheart, I'm so glad you could make it tonight. Your father was really hoping you'd be here." Her voice carried that particular tone people use when they're about to deliver news that's supposedly for your own good. "I wanted to have a quick word with you about something." I prepared myself for whatever was coming. Though I already knew the direction this conversation would take. Patricia had a gift for disguising criticism as concern, for making exclusion sound like protection. "Of course. What's on your mind?" She glanced around to make sure we had relative privacy, then moved a step closer, her voice dropping to that confidential tone people use when discussing sensitive topics. "I know how much these family gatherings mean to you, and I want you to know that you're always welcome here. You're part of this family no matter what." The "no matter what" hung in the air, clearly referring to my perceived financial limitations and social inadequacy. I waited for the "but" that was inevitably coming. "But I also want to be honest with you about something. Some of the family members and quite a few of Dad's business associates have been asking questions about your situation, your living arrangements, your career stability, that sort of thing." Translation: People had noticed that I didn't fit the family's image of success, and it was becoming socially awkward for them to explain my presence at their upscale gatherings. "I see. And what kinds of questions are they asking?" Patricia's expression shifted to one of motherly concern, the look she perfected for delivering difficult truths. "Well, honey, it's just that everyone else here tonight owns their own homes, has established careers, that sort of thing. When people ask about you, it's sometimes hard to know what to say." The message was becoming clearer. I was an embarrassment to the family's social standing, a reminder that not everyone in the Rodriguez family had achieved the level of success that their social circle expected. "I understand. You're concerned about appearances." "Not appearances for their own sake," she corrected quickly, though we both knew that was exactly what this was about. "I'm concerned about you feeling comfortable. I can see how you might feel out of place sometimes, especially when conversations turn to business or investments or real estate. It's perfectly natural." Out of place. The phrase echoed in my mind as I looked around the kitchen where I'd eaten countless childhood meals, the house where I'd grown up, surrounded by people, discussing business deals that I'd quietly funded from behind the scenes. "What are you suggesting, Patricia?" She reached out and touched my arm gently, the gesture of someone delivering compassionate advice. "Maybe it would be better if you focused on getting your own life more settled before joining these kinds of gatherings. Take some time to really establish yourself professionally, maybe save up for your own place, that sort of thing. Then when you do join us, you'll feel more confident, more like you belong. More like I belong. In the house where I'd grown up, at my own father's birthday party." The suggestion was so perfectly wrapped in concern that someone who didn't know, Patricia might actually believe she was trying to help me rather than exclude me. "So, you think I should skip family events until my finances improve?" "Just temporarily, sweetheart. Just until you're in a position where you feel comfortable with who you are and what you've accomplished. I think you'll find that confidence makes all the difference in how people respond to you." The conversation was a masterpiece of manipulation, framing my exclusion as my own choice based on my own comfort level, rather than their judgment of my worth. It was designed to make me grateful for the suggestion, to see it as kindness rather than rejection. I looked at this woman who'd married my father 15 years ago and slowly, methodically created distance between him and me, always with plausible explanations, always with apparent good intentions. Who'd raised her own children to see me as lesser, as someone to be pitied rather than respected. Who'd built a family hierarchy where love was conditional on financial success and social acceptability. "That's very thoughtful of you to be concerned about my comfort level," I said carefully. "I'll definitely give that some serious consideration." She smiled with relief, clearly believing she'd handled a delicate situation with appropriate sensitivity. "I'm so glad you understand, dear. It really is for the best, and I know that when you're ready, you'll come back stronger than ever." As we rejoined the remaining guests for final goodbyes, I caught Dad's eye across the room. He was deep in conversation with a business associate, but he looked up and smiled when he saw me, that same warm expression that had always made me feel loved and valued. In that moment, I made a decision about tomorrow that I'd been wavering on all evening. Patricia had just made it very clear that my place in this family was conditional, temporary, dependent on meeting standards that she would continue to move higher whenever I got close to reaching them. She'd essentially uninvited me from future family gatherings until I could prove myself worthy of inclusion. Tomorrow, she was going to learn exactly how worthy I'd become. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharp and full of possibility. I stood in my penthouse apartment overlooking the city, sipping coffee from a mug that had cost more than most people's monthly car payments, though you'd never know it from its simple, elegant design. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the sprawling metropolis that had become my empire. Dozens of properties scattered across the skyline that generated wealth while I slept. My phone had been buzzing since 7 a.m. with messages from my legal team, my property managers, and my financial advisors. Today wasn't just any day. It was the day I'd been building toward for 3 years. Ever since Patricia's last devastating conversation about my situation had finally pushed me past the point of quiet tolerance. Today was the day the Rodriguez family would learn that their financial security had been resting in my hands all along. Marcus arrived at 8:30 sharp, his arms full of carefully organized folders and his tablet loaded with presentations that would change everything. As my assistant and closest confidant in this long game I'd been playing, he understood the significance of this moment better than anyone. We'd spent months preparing for various scenarios, but Patricia's conversation last night had crystallized exactly which path we'd be taking. "Good morning, Maya. Ready to turn their world upside down?" His grin was infectious as he spread documents across my dining table, each one representing another piece of the puzzle that my family had never seen coming. "More than ready. After last night's little chat with Patricia about my comfort level at family gatherings, I think it's time they learned about mine." I pulled up the chair across from him, my mind already racing through the steps we'd rehearsed, but hoping we'd never need to execute. The first folder contained property deeds, not just for the Hillcrest estate where last night's party had taken place, but for the entire surrounding development that my father had always dreamed of owning completely. When the original owner had faced financial difficulties 18 months ago, Rodriguez Holdings had quietly purchased the entire portfolio through a series of shell companies and legal structures that kept my involvement completely hidden. The Hillcrest property alone is worth $12 million now, Marcus explained, though I knew these numbers by heart. But the real value is in the development rights for the adjacent lots. Your father's been trying to acquire those parcels for years. "And they've been mine for over a year," I murmured, running my fingers along the deed that bore my signature. The irony was delicious. Dad had been hosting business meetings in his study, discussing strategies for acquiring the very properties I already owned, while I sat quietly in the corner being dismissed as someone who couldn't possibly understand. Such complex financial matters. The second folder was even more revealing. Financial records showing the intricate web of loans, investments, and business partnerships that kept Dad's real estate empire running. What the family didn't know was that Rodriguez Holdings had become the silent partner in nearly every major deal he'd completed over the past 2 years. When banks had been hesitant to approve loans for his ambitious projects, my money had filled the gaps. When investors had backed out of promising ventures, my companies had stepped in to provide the necessary capital. The Westfield project, that was such a hit at the party last night. Marcus pulled out a thick contract with my signature on the final page. 60% of the funding came from your portfolio companies. Without your investment, that project never gets off the ground. I'd been incredibly careful to structure these investments through multiple layers of legal entities, ensuring that Dad's reputation in the industry remained intact, while my involvement stayed completely invisible. He genuinely believed he was still the successful, independent developer he'd always been, never suspecting that his daughter, the one who supposedly couldn't grasp basic business concepts, was the financial force behind his recent string of successes. "What about the family's personal finances?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Marcus's expression grew more serious as he opened the third folder. That's where things get interesting. The lifestyle they've been maintaining. Patricia's shopping habits, the kids' private school tuitions, the country club memberships, the luxury vacations. It's all been funded by profits from projects that your money made possible. The numbers were staggering when laid out so clearly. Jennifer's graduate school tuition, David's new BMW, Patricia's jewelry collection, even the catering costs for last night's birthday party, all of it traced back to revenue streams that I had quietly created and sustained. They'd been living off my success while treating me like a charity case who needed their pity and protection. "There's something else," Marcus continued, pulling out a smaller document that I recognized immediately. "The mortgage on the Hillcrest estate. Your father refinanced it last year to fund the downtown office building project. And who holds that mortgage now?" Rodriguez Holdings acquired it 6 months ago when the original lender needed to offload assets quickly. Technically, you could call that loan due at any time. The house where I'd grown up, where Patricia had just told me I didn't belong, where she'd suggested I needed to improve my financial situation before I'd be comfortable at family gatherings, I literally owned the mortgage on it. If I chose to exercise my rights as the lender, I could foreclose on the property that had been in our family for 2 generations. But foreclosure wasn't what I had in mind. What I wanted was much simpler. An infinitely more satisfying recognition. Not the kind that comes from titles or public acknowledgement, but the quiet recognition that comes from people finally seeing you clearly, understanding who you really are beneath their assumptions and prejudices. My phone rang, interrupting my review of the documents. Dad's name appeared on the screen, and I felt a familiar flutter of hope mixed with apprehension. Despite everything, despite Patricia's influence and the family dynamics that had pushed me to the margins, I still loved this man who had taught me everything I knew about integrity and perseverance. "Hi, Dad. How are you feeling this morning? Not too rough after the party, I hope." His laughter was warm and genuine, the sound that had always made me feel safe and valued. A little tired, but it was worth it. "Thank you again for coming last night, sweetheart. It meant the world to me to have you there." There was something in his voice, a note of sadness or regret that made me wonder if he'd overheard Patricia's conversation with me in the kitchen. Had he noticed the way she'd maneuvered me away from business discussions, the subtle ways she'd marginalized my presence at what was supposed to be a family celebration? "I wouldn't have missed it, Dad. 70 is a big milestone." "Maya, I wanted to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me." His tone shifted, becoming more serious. "Are you happy? Really happy with how your life is going?" The question caught me off guard, not because I didn't know the answer, but because it suggested he'd been thinking about my situation more deeply than I'd realized. For a moment, I considered telling him everything. About Rodriguez Holdings, about the investments, about the fact that his recent business successes had been possible because of my financial backing. But something held me back. Maybe the memory of too many conversations where Patricia had steered him away from taking my perspectives seriously. "I'm doing really well, Dad. Better than most people realize, actually." "I hope that's true. I worry sometimes that we haven't. That I haven't been as supportive as I should have been. Family should lift each other up, not make anyone feel like they have to prove their worth." The statement was so close to an apology that my chest tightened with emotion. This was the father I remembered from my childhood, the man who had taught me that success meant building something meaningful, not just accumulating wealth or status symbols. The man who had somehow gotten lost in Patricia's world of social hierarchies and financial scorekeeping. "Dad, what would you say if I told you I'd been more successful than anyone in the family realizes? That maybe the assumptions about my financial situation haven't been accurate?" There was a long pause, and I could almost hear him thinking through the implications of my question. "I'd say I wouldn't be surprised. You were always the smartest one in the family, Maya. Always saw things the rest of us missed." "Even smarter than Jennifer and David?" "Especially smarter than Jennifer and David. They're good kids, but they've had everything handed to them. You had to build your own path, create your own opportunities. That kind of experience teaches lessons that money can't buy." His words carried weight that I hadn't expected, suggesting that maybe he'd been paying more attention to family dynamics than I'd given him credit for. Maybe he'd noticed Patricia's tendency to elevate her own children while diminishing mine. Maybe he'd been bothered by it, but hadn't known how to address it without creating conflict in his marriage. "What if I told you that some of your recent business successes had been possible because of financial backing you didn't know about? From someone who wanted to see you succeed, but preferred to stay anonymous?" Another pause, longer this time. "I'd say that person must care about me a great deal, and I'd want to thank them properly. And what if that person was someone you already knew? Someone close to the family?" "Maya." His voice was quiet now, thoughtful. "Are you trying to tell me something?" Before I could answer, I heard Patricia's voice in the background, asking who he was talking to and reminding him about some appointment they had that morning. The moment of connection fractured, replaced by the familiar sound of him being pulled back into the orbit of responsibilities and relationships that kept us apart. "I should let you go, Dad. But maybe we could have lunch sometime soon? Just the two of us?" "I'd love that, sweetheart. Let me check my schedule and I'll call you this week." After he hung up, I sat staring at my phone for several minutes, thinking about roads not taken and conversations that had come 3 years too late. If he'd asked those questions, shown that level of awareness and concern, back when Patricia first started her campaign to exclude me from family gatherings, maybe things would have developed differently. Maybe I wouldn't have felt the need to prove my worth through elaborate financial chess games played from behind the curtain of anonymity. But then again, maybe this was exactly how things needed to happen. Maybe I needed to build something entirely independent, something that belonged to me alone, before I could engage with my family from a position of strength rather than need. Maybe Patricia's rejection had been the catalyst that pushed me to discover capabilities I never would have developed otherwise. Marcus looked up from his laptop where he'd been reviewing presentation slides. "Everything okay? You look like you're processing something heavy." "Just thinking about whether Dad suspects anything. He's asking questions that suggest he might be putting pieces together." "Would that change your plans for today?" I considered the question carefully. The original plan had been to wait for the next family gathering, probably Christmas, and reveal everything in front of the extended family and Patricia's social circle. Maximum impact, maximum vindication, the kind of dramatic moment that would become family legend. But Patricia's conversation last night had accelerated my timeline and intensified my motivation. No, it doesn't change anything. If anything, it makes me more determined to do this right. Dad deserves to know the truth, and Patricia deserves to confront the reality of how wrong she's been about me. So we're moving forward with the estate meeting this afternoon? The estate meeting was our masterstroke, a gathering I'd requested, through my lawyers to discuss important matters affecting the family properties. Patricia and the kids assumed it was some kind of legal formality, maybe related to insurance or taxes. Dad was curious, but hadn't pressed for details when his attorney had recommended he attend. None of them suspected that I would be there, much less that I would be the one presenting information that would reshape their understanding of their own financial security. Absolutely. It's time they learned that the family member they've been treating like a charity case has been their financial guardian angel all along. Marcus smiled and pulled out his tablet, scrolling through photos from various family events over the past 2 years. You know what I find most interesting about this whole situation? You could have revealed the truth at any point. You could have demanded recognition, insisted on being included in business discussions, made them acknowledge your contributions. But then it would have been about ego, about forcing them to respect me. This way, when the truth comes out, it's not because I demanded recognition. It's because the evidence is undeniable. And Patricia's conversation last night? Patricia's conversation last night was the final confirmation that they're never going to see me differently unless they're forced to. She essentially told me I'm not welcome at family gatherings until I can prove I belong. Well, this afternoon she's going to learn exactly how much I belong. The morning passed quickly as we finalized presentation materials and confirmed logistics with the legal team. At 1 o'clock, I changed into a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the kind of outfit that whispered authority without shouting wealth. My hair was pulled back in a sleek chignon, my makeup subtle but flawless. I looked like exactly what I was, a successful businesswoman who commanded respect in boardrooms and negotiation tables. As Marcus and I drove toward the law office where the meeting would take place, I thought about the girl who had been dismissed from family gatherings 3 years ago. She'd been struggling, certainly, working freelance jobs that barely covered rent, living with roommates in a cramped apartment, wearing discount store clothes to family events because she couldn't afford anything better. Patricia hadn't been wrong about the financial facts. She'd been wrong about their permanence and their significance. That struggling girl had used the pain of rejection as fuel, transforming hurt into determination and exclusion into motivation. Every snub, every condescending comment, every moment of being made to feel less than had been converted into energy for building something extraordinary. Patricia had intended to teach me a lesson about knowing my place. Instead, she'd taught me that my place was wherever I chose to make it. Nervous? Marcus asked as we pulled into the parking lot. Excited, I corrected. I've been imagining this moment for 3 years. The look on Patricia's face when she realizes that the family member she's been treating like a burden has been carrying the family financially. The moment Jennifer and David understand that their lifestyle has been subsidized by someone they've been taught to pity. And your dad? That was the complicated part. I wasn't angry at Dad the way I was at Patricia. His failures had been sins of omission rather than commission, allowing Patricia to create distance rather than actively working to exclude me. When he learned the truth this afternoon, I hoped his primary emotion would be pride, not shame. Dad's going to be shocked, but I think he'll also be impressed. He always said he wanted me to be independent and successful. He just never imagined I'd become successful enough to be his silent business partner. As we walked toward the law office, my phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer. Hey, do you know what this meeting is about today? Mom seems worried and won't tell us anything. The fact that she was reaching out to me for information was ironic, considering that in a few hours she'd understand I'd been the source of information that really mattered all along. I texted back, just some family business stuff, nothing to worry about. Which was technically true, though probably not in the way she'd interpret it. The law office was impressive in the understated way that suggested serious money and serious consequences. Patricia, Jennifer, and David were already seated in the conference room when we arrived, looking slightly uncomfortable and very curious. Dad sat at the head of the table, his expression puzzled but patient. When they saw me walk in behind the lawyers, their confusion deepened visibly. "Maya? What are you doing here?" Patricia's voice carried that familiar note of irritation barely, disguised as surprise. "She's here because she's the reason we're all here," announced my attorney, Richard Chen, no relation despite the shared name. "Ms. Rodriguez has some information to share about the family's financial situation that will affect everyone in this room." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of papers rustling as Richard and his team set up presentation materials. I took my seat at the table, directly across from Patricia, close enough to watch every micro-expression cross her face as the truth unfolded. "Before we begin," I said, looking around the table at each family member, "I want you to know that everything you're about to learn has been done out of love for this family, particularly for Dad. Sometimes the people who care most about us are the ones we see least clearly." Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly, her instincts clearly telling her that whatever was coming wouldn't be good news for her carefully constructed narrative about family hierarchy and social standing. "Now then," Richard began, pulling up the first slide of what would become the most satisfying presentation of my life. "Let's discuss the true financial structure of the Rodriguez family holdings, and who has really been responsible for your recent prosperity." The moment of revelation was finally here, 3 years in the making, and I had never felt more ready to reclaim my place in a family that had forgotten how to see me clearly. The first slide illuminated the conference room with stark financial clarity that cut through years of assumptions like a blade through silk. Rodriguez Holdings financial portfolio, annual revenue $47 million. The number hung in the air, impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss. I watched Patricia's face transform from polite confusion to dawning horror as the implications began to sink in. Jennifer was the first to break the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "That can't be right. Maya works as a freelance graphic designer." "Actually," Richard continued with professional precision, "Ms. Rodriguez ceased freelance work approximately 26 months ago when her investment portfolio reached sufficient size to provide complete financial independence. Rodriguez Holdings currently manages a diversified portfolio, including 43 commercial properties, 12 residential complexes, and strategic partnerships in 7 major development projects." David's pen clattered onto the table. 43. Properties? That's more than Dad's entire company manages. Dad sat frozen, his eyes moving between the presentation screen and my face as if trying to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the business empire being revealed. His expression wasn't anger or disappointment. It was something closer to awe, mixed with profound confusion about how he'd missed something so significant happening right under his nose. "But this is impossible," Patricia interjected, her voice rising with the particular strain of someone whose worldview was crumbling in real time. "We would have known. Maya lives with roommates, drives an old car, shops at discount stores. She doesn't have money for rent, let alone property investments." I smiled, speaking for the first time since the presentation began. "I live with roommates because I enjoy their company, and the arrangement allows me to travel frequently for business without worrying about an empty house. I drive a modest car because I prefer to invest in appreciating assets rather than depreciating ones. And I shop carefully because I learned early that wealth is built through intelligent spending, not expensive displays." The silence that followed was deafening. Years of their assumptions about my financial limitations were colliding with evidence that painted a completely different picture. Richard advanced to the next slide, showing a detailed breakdown of property acquisitions over the past 3 years. Each purchase had been strategic, methodical, building toward a portfolio that generated passive income while appreciating in value. The acquisition timeline is particularly interesting, Richard noted. Ms. Rodriguez began her property investments approximately 6 months after the last family gathering where her attendance was discouraged due to financial concerns. The euphemism hung heavy in the room. Everyone remembered that gathering, the Christmas dinner where Patricia had pulled me aside and suggested that my financial struggles were making other family members uncomfortable, that perhaps I should focus on getting established before joining future celebrations. The humiliation of that conversation had been the catalyst for everything that followed. Maya. Dad's voice was quiet, almost reverent. How did you build all this? Where did the initial capital come from? It was the question I'd been waiting for, the opening to share the story that had transformed rejection into rocket fuel for success. Remember the graphic design business I was struggling with? It wasn't failing because I lacked talent or clients. It was struggling because I was treating it like a traditional service business instead of thinking bigger. Richard pulled up the next slide, showing the evolution of my business model from freelance work to comprehensive brand development to strategic business consulting. Ms. Rodriguez identified that her clients weren't just buying design services. They were buying solutions to communication problems that affected their entire business operations. I started analyzing why some businesses succeeded while others failed, regardless of how good their marketing materials looked. I realized that success came down to systems, processes, and strategic thinking about market positioning. So I stopped selling design services and started selling business transformation. Jennifer leaned forward, her earlier shock giving way to genuine curiosity. But that still doesn't explain this level of wealth. Consulting fees, even high-end ones, don't generate $47 million in annual revenue. You're absolutely right. Consulting provided the initial capital and the business education I needed, but real wealth came from recognizing patterns in the market that others were missing. Every business owner I worked with was struggling with the same fundamental challenge: finding affordable commercial space in growing markets. The next slide showed a map of the metropolitan area, dotted with markers indicating property acquisitions. Each dot represented a calculated bet on neighborhoods that were undervalued but positioned for growth. I wasn't just helping businesses solve their immediate problems. I was studying where successful businesses needed to locate and buying those properties before demand drove prices up. David was studying the map intently, his finance background allowing him to grasp the strategy more quickly than the others. You were essentially front-running commercial real estate development, buying in areas you knew would appreciate because you were helping create the demand. Exactly. When you're working with dozens of growing businesses, you start to see patterns in where they want to expand, what kind of spaces they need, what they're willing to pay for the right location. Instead of just consulting on their growth, I started investing in the infrastructure that would support that growth. Patricia's face had gone through several color changes during this explanation, settling on a pale shade that suggested she was beginning to understand the magnitude of her miscalculation. But why hide it? Why let us think you were struggling when you were building this empire? The question carried an accusatory tone, as if my privacy about personal finances had somehow been deceptive rather than prudent. I looked across the table at this woman who had spent 3 years systematically excluding me from family gatherings while unknowingly benefiting from my financial success. I didn't hide anything, Patricia. I simply didn't announce it. There's a difference between privacy and deception. Besides, I learned early that people treat you differently when they know you have money. They either want something from you, or they assume your success diminishes their own worth. I preferred to be valued for who I am rather than what I own. Dad was studying the property map with increasing amazement. Maya, some of these locations, the Westfield project, the downtown office complex, the industrial park conversion. I've been trying to get development rights in these areas for years. Richard smiled, clearly anticipating this revelation. That brings us to the most interesting part of Ms. Rodriguez's portfolio. Marcus, would you bring up the partnership structure slides? Marcus stepped forward with his tablet, pulling up documents that would reshape Dad's understanding of his own business success. Mr. Rodriguez, your development company has had remarkable success over the past 2 years. Project completion rates above industry average, financing secured at favorable terms, access to prime development sites that other firms couldn't acquire. I've been proud of that record, Dad said cautiously, sensing that this statement was leading somewhere significant. You should be proud. Those successes were achieved through strategic partnerships with various investment groups and property holding companies. What you might not have realized is that many of those partnerships trace back to a single source. The next slide showed a complex organizational chart, with Rodriguez Holdings at the center and lines connecting to various shell companies and investment vehicles. Many of those entities had familiar names, companies that had provided financing for Dad's projects, partners who had brought development opportunities to his attention, investors who had stepped in when traditional funding fell through. Patricia's voice was barely a whisper. You've been funding Robert's business deals. Not funding, I corrected. Partnering. Dad's projects have been successful because they're good projects managed by someone with excellent instincts for market development. My capital provided access and opportunity, but his expertise turned those opportunities into profitable reality. The distinction was important to me. I hadn't been propping up a failing business out of charity. I'd been investing in genuine opportunities that benefited both of us. Dad's success hadn't been artificial or dependent. It had been accelerated and amplified by having a silent partner who understood market dynamics and could move quickly when opportunities arose. Dad was staring at the organizational chart with an expression of profound bewilderment. The Westfield project, the downtown office building, the industrial conversion. You were the silent partner in all of those deals? Among others, 18 projects over 2 years, with combined profits that exceeded projections by an average of 32%. We make a good team, Dad, even when you didn't know we were working together. Jennifer was frantically scribbling notes, her analytical mind trying to process the implications. But what about the house? The family property? If you've been this successful, why haven't you bought your own place instead of living with roommates? Richard advanced to a slide that I knew would be the most shocking revelation of all. A property deed appeared on screen, clearly showing the Hillcrest family estate with my name listed as the primary owner. The date of acquisition was 18 months earlier, when the original family trust had needed to be restructured due to tax implications. The silence that followed was absolute. Patricia's face went completely white. David dropped his pen again. Jennifer's mouth fell open in an expression of cartoon-like surprise. Dad simply stared at the document as if it were written in a foreign language. You own our house? Patricia's voice cracked on the last word. I own the mortgage on the house, I clarified. When Dad needed to refinance to fund the downtown office project, Rodriguez Holdings acquired the loan from the original lender. The house is still the family residence, still the place where Dad lives and hosts gatherings. The ownership structure just ensures that the property remains in family hands regardless of market fluctuations. Dad found his voice first, though. It sounded strained and confused. Maya, why didn't you tell me? If you were in a position to help with financing, why go through all these shell companies and legal structures? It was the heart of the matter, the question that got to the emotional core of what I'd been doing and why. I looked around the table at faces showing various degrees of shock, embarrassment, and dawning understanding. Because 3 years ago, I was told that my financial situation made other family members uncomfortable. I was suggested that I should focus on getting my life together before attending family gatherings. I was made to feel like my struggles reflected poorly on the family's social standing. Patricia's face flushed deep red as the memory of those conversations came rushing back. Maya, that was different. You were struggling then, and I was trying to protect you from feeling out of place. Protect me? Or protect yourself from the embarrassment of having a family member who didn't fit the image you wanted to project? The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but they carried the weight of 3 years of accumulated hurt and determination. You were living paycheck to paycheck, taking design jobs that barely covered rent. It wasn't about embarrassment. It was about reality. The reality was that I was in a transition period, building something bigger than anyone could see from the outside. But instead of asking about my plans or offering support or encouragement, the family made assumptions about my worth based on my current circumstances. David was still studying the financial documents, his expression growing more amazed with each page. Maya, these numbers. You've been more successful than any of us. More successful than all of us combined. Success isn't a competition, David. I didn't build this portfolio to prove I was better than anyone else. I built it because I wanted financial security and the freedom to live life on my own terms. The fact that it grew beyond my initial expectations was a pleasant surprise, not a calculated attempt to show up the family. Dad was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd learned. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of regret that made my chest tighten. Sweetheart, I feel like I've failed you somehow. Not just as a father, but as someone who should have recognized what you were building. Dad, you didn't fail me. You taught me everything that made this success possible. The importance of hard work, the value of treating people fairly, the understanding that real wealth comes from building something meaningful rather than just accumulating money. But I let Patricia convince me that you needed our protection rather than our support. I should have seen that you were building something extraordinary. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly realizing that this conversation was heading toward a reckoning with her role in creating family division. I was trying to help, Maya. I thought you were struggling and needed guidance. What you thought was that I was an embarrassment to the family's social status. What you said was that I couldn't afford to keep up with everyone else's lifestyle and should focus on getting my life together before showing my face at family events. I never said it like that. Marcus pulled out his phone and began scrolling through recordings. Actually, Mrs. Rodriguez, we have audio from last night's conversation in the kitchen. Would you like me to play the relevant sections? The threat of having her own words played back to her silenced Patricia immediately. She'd been careful to phrase her exclusion as concern for my comfort, but the underlying message had been unmistakably clear. I wasn't welcome until I could prove I belonged. Jennifer was still processing the financial implications, her voice thoughtful as she worked through the numbers. Maya, if you own this much property, if you're generating this much revenue, why are you revealing it now? What changed? It was an excellent question, one that got to the strategic thinking behind my decision to end 3 years of financial anonymity. What changed was last night's conversation with Patricia about my comfort level at family gatherings. She suggested that I should skip family events until my finances improved enough for me to feel like I belonged. I was trying to be helpful, Patricia protested weakly. You were trying to exclude me permanently. The suggestion wasn't that I should improve my finances. It was that I should stay away until I achieved some undefined level of success that would make my presence socially acceptable. Dad was looking at Patricia with an expression I'd rarely seen from him, disappointment mixed with something that might have been anger. Patricia, you told Maya she shouldn't come to family gatherings? I suggested she might be more comfortable, focusing on her own development before joining social events where she might feel out of place. Our daughter felt out of place at family gatherings because you made her feel that way, not because of her financial situation. The conversation was shifting in ways I hadn't expected, with Dad beginning to understand not just my financial success, but the emotional dynamics that had driven me to keep it secret. Richard seemed to sense that this was becoming more personal. Family discussion than legal presentation. Perhaps this would be a good time to discuss the practical implications of these revelations, he suggested diplomatically. Ms. Rodriguez asked for this meeting because recent family conversations have raised questions about her future participation in family activities. Patricia's face went through several expressions before settling on something that looked like panic. Maya, you're not planning to use this information to hurt the family, are you? The question revealed so much about how she viewed relationships and power dynamics. In her mind, knowledge of my financial success must be a weapon, to be used for revenge rather than information that could reshape family interactions for the better. Patricia, I'm not interested in hurting anyone. I'm interested in being seen clearly by my own family, without the filters of assumptions about my worth or capabilities. But what does that mean practically? David asked. What changes now? That we know all this? It was the question I'd been building toward for 3 years, the moment when I could finally articulate what I wanted from these relationships. It means that when family business is discussed, I'm included as someone who understands financial strategy rather than excluded as someone who couldn't possibly grasp such complex concepts. It means that when investment opportunities arise, you consider whether I might be interested in participating rather than assuming I couldn't afford to be involved. It means that when family gatherings are planned, my invitation isn't conditional on meeting some arbitrary standard of financial respectability. Jennifer was nodding slowly, beginning to understand the broader implications. You want to be treated like the successful business owner you actually are, rather than the struggling freelancer we thought you were. I want to be treated like a member of this family whose worth isn't determined by external circumstances or other people's comfort with my lifestyle choices. Dad reached across the table and took my hand, his expression full of regret and something that looked like pride. Maya, I'm so sorry. Not just for not seeing what you were building, but for allowing you to feel like you had to hide it from us. You don't need to apologize, Dad. You need to understand that the daughter you raised turned out exactly like you hoped she would. Independent, successful, and committed to family. You just didn't recognize it because it didn't look like what you expected. Patricia was studying the financial documents with the intensity of someone trying to find an escape clause in a contract that had already been signed. Maya, this is all very impressive, but what do you want from us now? What are your expectations? The question was loaded with anxiety about whether I planned to use my newfound leverage to demand changes in family dynamics or extract some kind of compensation for years of being underestimated. Her fear was revealing. She understood that she'd miscalculated badly and was bracing for consequences. I want what I've always wanted, Patricia, to be included in my own family without having to prove my worth or apologize for my circumstances. To have my perspectives valued and my success acknowledged, to attend family gatherings as a welcome participant rather than a charity case who needs protection from her own inadequacy. And if the family isn't ready to make those adjustments? It was a fascinating question, revealing that even after learning about my financial success, Patricia was still thinking in terms of whether the family would choose to accept me rather than recognizing that they were lucky to have maintained any relationship with me at all. Marcus pulled out his tablet and began scrolling through documents. Mrs. Rodriguez, perhaps it would help to understand the current financial interdependencies. Your husband's business success over the past 2 years has been substantially supported by Maya's capital, the family's lifestyle, private school, tuitions, country club memberships, luxury vacations, has been funded by profits from projects that Maya made possible. Your son David's graduate school was paid for with dividends from investments that Maya structured. Your daughter Jennifer's wedding expenses came from revenue generated by Maya's property portfolio. Even last night's birthday party was catered using profits from the Westfield Development Project, which exists because Maya provided 60% of the initial funding. The litany of financial connections was devastating in its comprehensiveness. Every aspect of their elevated lifestyle over the past 2 years could be traced back to my success, creating a web of dependency that made their dismissive treatment of me seem not just unfair, but absurdly ungrateful. Patricia's voice was barely audible. "We had no idea." "That's exactly the point," I replied. "You had no idea, but you made assumptions anyway. You decided I was struggling and needed your guidance rather than asking about my actual situation. You excluded me from family activities based on what you thought you knew, rather than what was actually true." Dad was shaking his head slowly, his expression conveying disbelief at the magnitude of what he'd missed. "Maya, how do we fix this? How do we move forward knowing that we've been so wrong about so much?" The question opened the door to the conversation I'd been hoping to have for 3 years. The opportunity to reshape family relationships based on accurate understanding rather than harmful assumptions. The success I'd built hadn't been about money. It had been about creating the financial security and social leverage necessary to have this exact conversation from a position of strength rather than need. The question hung in the air like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and I realized this was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since the day I'd decided to transform rejection into rocket fuel. Dad's genuine desire to repair our relationship, coupled with his newfound understanding of who I'd become, created an opening for the kind of family dynamics I'd always hoped were possible. Moving forward starts with understanding that this was never about money, I began, my voice steady with the confidence that comes from finally being seen clearly. The financial success was a byproduct of something more important: learning to value myself regardless of other people's opinions or approval. I stood and walked to the window overlooking the city skyline, where dozens of my properties generated wealth while their owners lived their lives. 3 years ago, when Patricia suggested I should stay away from family gatherings until I could afford to feel comfortable, I had 2 choices. I could spend years trying to convince you that I was worthy of inclusion, or I could build something so undeniable that worthiness would never be a question again. Jennifer leaned forward, her analytical mind engaging with the deeper implications of what I'd accomplished. "You didn't just build wealth, Maya. You built independence. Financial, emotional, social, complete independence from anyone's judgment about your value." Exactly. And that independence gave me something more valuable than money: the freedom to choose my relationships based on love and respect, rather than need or obligation. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly beginning to understand that this conversation wasn't just about correcting past misunderstandings, but about establishing new terms for future interactions. "Maya, I want you to know that I never intended to make you feel unwelcome. I thought I was protecting you from embarrassment. Patricia, the road to damaged relationships is paved with good intentions. What matters isn't what you intended. It's what actually happened. And what happened was that you created a family hierarchy where love was conditional on meeting external standards of success." Dad was studying the financial documents with an expression that mixed amazement with something deeper, a recognition that his daughter had not only survived family rejection, but had transformed it into extraordinary achievement. "Maya, I'm looking at these numbers and I'm realizing you didn't just become successful. You became more successful than I ever dreamed of being." Success isn't a competition, Dad. But you're right that what I built exceeded my own expectations. When you're motivated by proving wrong the people who dismissed you, you sometimes surprise yourself with what becomes possible. Marcus pulled up a new presentation slide, showing a timeline of major achievements over the past 3 years. What's remarkable about Maya's story isn't just the financial results. It's the systematic way she approached building success while maintaining her values and integrity. The timeline was visually striking, showing the progression from freelance graphic design to business consulting to strategic property investment to comprehensive wealth management. Each phase had built on the previous one, creating compound growth that accelerated as opportunities multiplied. The first year was about survival and learning, I explained, walking back to the table. I took every consulting project I could get, worked 18-hour days, lived on ramen noodles and determination. But I wasn't just working, I was studying. Every client taught me something about what made businesses succeed or fail. David was examining the consulting revenue figures with professional interest. These numbers are impressive for someone working alone. How did you scale so quickly without taking on employees or overhead? I realized that the most valuable service I could provide wasn't doing work for clients. It was teaching them to solve problems themselves. Instead of selling design services, I started selling transformation systems. Instead of creating dependency, I was creating capability. The distinction was crucial to understanding how I'd built something sustainable rather than just profitable. Traditional consulting creates ongoing dependency. Clients need you to continue providing service indefinitely. What I'd developed was a methodology for helping businesses become self-sufficient while generating results that exceeded what they could achieve on their own. But that still doesn't explain the leap to property investment, Jennifer observed. Consulting income, even high-end consulting, doesn't typically generate the kind of capital needed for real estate acquisition. Richard pulled up a slide showing the transition strategy that had made everything possible. Ms. Rodriguez recognized that her consulting work was giving her unique insight into commercial real estate demand. She wasn't just helping businesses solve problems. She was learning where those businesses needed to locate to maximize their success. Every client conversation taught me something about location strategy, market timing, or space utilization. I started seeing patterns in what successful businesses needed from their physical environments. Instead of just advising them on these decisions, I began investing in the properties they would eventually need. The strategy had been elegantly simple in concept, but complex in execution. I'd used consulting income to make small property investments in areas where I knew demand would increase because I was helping create that demand. As those investments appreciated and generated rental income, I'd reinvested in larger properties with better return potential. It's like having insider information, except completely legal, Dad mused, his businessman's mind appreciating the strategic elegance. You were essentially investing ahead of market demand because you were helping create that demand. Exactly. And as the portfolio grew, I gained access to better investment opportunities, more favorable financing terms, and strategic partnerships that accelerated growth even further. Patricia was quiet during this explanation, but I could see her processing the implications of what she was hearing. The family member she'd dismissed as financially incompetent had not only achieved independence, but had done so through sophisticated strategic thinking that impressed even Dad's business-savvy friends. Maya, she said finally, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect. I owe you an apology, not just for misunderstanding your situation, but for making assumptions about your capabilities. The apology was significant, given Patricia's general reluctance to admit error, but I sensed it was motivated more by recognition of my financial power than genuine understanding of the emotional damage her exclusion had caused. I appreciate that, Patricia, but apologies need to be accompanied by changes in behavior. Understanding that you were wrong about my financial situation is only valuable if it leads to different assumptions about my worth and capabilities going forward. What kind of changes are you looking for? Dad asked, his tone suggesting genuine willingness to address whatever had gone wrong in our family dynamics. It was the opening I'd been hoping for. The chance to articulate not just what had been problematic in the past, but what healthy family relationships could look like going forward. I'd spent 3 years not just building wealth, but thinking about what kind of family interactions would be meaningful and sustainable. I want to be included in family business discussions as someone whose expertise and perspective add value, rather than excluded as someone who wouldn't understand complex topics. When investment opportunities arise, I want to be considered as a potential partner, rather than dismissed as someone who couldn't afford to participate. I want family gatherings to be planned with my schedule in mind, rather than organized around the assumption that I'll be grateful for whatever inclusion I'm offered. Jennifer was taking notes, her systematic mind organizing these requests into actionable changes. Those all seem reasonable, Maya. More than reasonable, given what we now know about your success. But there's something deeper than just changing specific behaviors, I continued. The underlying issue was that the family's treatment of me was based on assumptions about my worth rather than curiosity about who I actually was and what I was building. David nodded slowly, beginning to understand the broader principle at stake. You want to be seen and valued for who you are, rather than judged based on external circumstances that don't tell the whole story. That's exactly right, and that principle applies to everyone, not just me. Success looks different for different people, and someone's worth to a family shouldn't be determined by their current financial situation or social status. Dad was quiet for a moment, then spoke with the kind of emotional honesty that had always made me love him despite our complicated family dynamics. Maya, I think what you're describing is the kind of family I thought we were, but obviously weren't. I'm proud of what you've built, but I'm more proud of who you've become. Someone who could achieve this level of success while maintaining your integrity and your commitment to family. The integrity part was crucial, I replied. I could have revealed my financial situation at any point to demand respect or force inclusion, but I wanted relationships based on genuine love and respect rather than obligation or intimidation. Marcus pulled up a final slide showing projected growth for Rodriguez Holdings over the next 5 years. The numbers were staggering. Property, values appreciating, rental income increasing, new development projects coming online. By conservative estimates, my net worth would triple within the decade. Looking at these projections, he said, Maya will likely become one of the most significant property owners in the metropolitan area within the next few years. The question isn't whether she needs family acceptance, it's whether the family recognizes the opportunity to be part of something extraordinary. The shift in perspective was deliberate and important. Instead of framing this as Maya needing family inclusion, the conversation was repositioning around the family's opportunity to maintain relationships with someone whose success could benefit everyone involved. Patricia's expression had evolved throughout the presentation from shock to embarrassment to what looked like strategic recalculation. Maya, I hope you know that we want to be part of your life, regardless of your financial situation. Regardless of or because of? I asked pointedly. Because there's an important difference between accepting someone despite their circumstances and embracing them because of their success. The question forced everyone to confront their own motivations for wanting improved relationships. Were they interested in repairing family bonds because they'd realized their treatment of me had been unfair, or because they'd learned I could be valuable to them financially? Dad answered first, his voice carrying the weight of genuine emotion. Maya, I want you in my life because you're my daughter and I love you. The financial success is impressive, but what I'm most proud of is the person you've become. Resilient, independent, generous enough to support family business without needing credit or recognition. That's what I needed to hear, Dad. Not that you're impressed by my money, but that you value who I am as a person. Jennifer was studying the investment timeline with growing amazement. Maya, what strikes me most about this story is that you didn't just survive family rejection. You used it as motivation to become the best version of yourself. That's incredible mental strength. Mental strength developed through necessity, I corrected. When you're excluded from family support systems, you either develop independence or you remain dependent on people who've made it clear you don't belong. I chose independence. But you didn't choose isolation, David observed. You maintained relationships while building something separate. That takes emotional sophistication. It takes understanding that love and approval are different things. I never stopped loving this family, but I stopped needing your approval to feel worthy or successful. The distinction was crucial to everything that had happened over the past 3 years. Needing approval makes you vulnerable to manipulation and conditional relationships. Building self-worth, independent of external validation, creates the foundation for healthy relationships based on mutual respect rather than emotional dependency. Richard began organizing documents as the formal presentation concluded. Ms. Rodriguez asked for this meeting to clarify her financial situation and discuss future family dynamics. I believe we've accomplished both objectives. We have, I agreed. But there's one more thing I want to address before we finish. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a text message I'd received that morning from my cousin Elena, who lived across the country and had always been supportive despite the family drama surrounding my exclusion from gatherings. Elena sent me, "Something interesting this morning," I said, reading from the screen. She said, "I always knew you were destined for something special. The way you handled family rejection with grace and determination told me everything I needed to know about your character." Oh, yo! The message had arrived at the perfect time, reminding me that not everyone in the family had bought into Patricia's narrative about my financial struggles reflecting personal inadequacy. Some people had recognized that circumstances are temporary, while character is permanent. The point is, I continued, there were family members who saw my potential even when others saw only problems. The difference wasn't access to information. It was the lens through which they chose to view me. Patricia's face flushed as she realized the implication. She'd had access to the same information as Elena, but had chosen to interpret my situation as evidence of inadequacy rather than temporary circumstances that would eventually change. "Maya, you're right," she said quietly. "I should have seen your struggles as temporary setbacks rather than permanent limitations. I should have offered support instead of suggesting exclusion. The past can't be changed, Patricia, but the future can be different. The question is whether we can build family relationships based on love and respect rather than judgments about success and social acceptability." Dad stood and walked around the table, pulling me into one of his characteristic bear hugs that had always made everything feel safer. "Maya, I want you to know that you'll always have a place in this family, not because of what you've built, but because of who you are. The success is just proof of what I should have recognized all along." As we separated, I saw tears in his eyes, not from sadness, but from pride, mixed with regret about lost time and missed opportunities to support my journey. "I love you, sweetheart, and I'm sorry it took learning about your financial success for me to fully appreciate what an extraordinary person you've become. I love you too, Dad, and I hope that going forward we can have regular conversations about business, investment opportunities, and family planning where my input is valued." "Absolutely. In fact, I'd like to discuss the possibility of more direct collaboration on future projects now that I know about your investment capabilities." Jennifer was organizing her notes into what looked like action items for family relationship improvement. "Maya, would you be willing to attend family gatherings going forward? I think everyone would benefit from having you there as yourself, rather than who we thought you were." "I'd enjoy that, Jennifer, assuming the invitations are genuine rather than obligatory, and assuming my presence is wanted rather than tolerated." David raised his hand like a student asking permission to speak. "Can I just say that this whole experience has been educational about assumptions and judgments? I mean, here we all were, feeling sorry for Maya's financial situation, while she was quietly building an empire that puts all our accomplishments in perspective." "The lesson isn't about financial competition," I corrected gently. "It's about seeing people clearly, rather than through the filter of assumptions. Everyone in this family has accomplishments worth celebrating. The difference is that some of us were celebrated while others were pitied, based on incomplete information. Marcus began packing up presentation materials as the formal meeting concluded, but the family conversation was just beginning. Patricia looked exhausted by the emotional roller coaster of learning how wrong she'd been about someone she'd dismissed for 3 years. Maya, I know this doesn't fix everything immediately, but I want you to know that I understand I was wrong. Not just about your financial situation, but about my role in creating family division. Understanding is the first step, Patricia. The next step is making sure that recognition leads to different behavior going forward. What does that look like practically? It looks like including me in family planning conversations, asking for my input on business decisions, and treating me like the successful professional I've become rather than the struggling freelancer you thought I was. And if I mess up? If I fall back into old patterns? The question showed more self-awareness than I'd expected from someone who rarely admitted fault. Then we address it directly rather than letting resentment build. Healthy relationships require ongoing communication and course correction. As we prepared to leave the conference room, Dad pulled me aside for a private moment. Maya, I know I can't undo the past 3 years, but I want to make sure I understand what you need from me going forward. I need you to see me clearly, Dad. Not as someone who needs protection or guidance, but as an equal partner in family conversations and business discussions. I need you to value my perspectives and include me in planning for the family's future. Done. And Maya? I want you to know that learning about your success today didn't change how proud I am of you. I was already proud of the person you'd become. The financial achievement just helped me understand how much I'd underestimated what you were capable of. As we walked toward the parking lot, my phone buzzed with notifications from family members who'd already heard about the meeting results. Word travels fast in families, especially when it involves dramatic revelations about secret wealth and years of misunderstood relationships. Ready for the family group chat to explode? Marcus asked with a grin. More than ready, I replied, feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time in 3 years, I can engage with family conversations as myself, rather than who they assumed I was. The drive back to my penthouse apartment gave me time to process what had just happened. I'd successfully transformed 3 years of rejection into the foundation for healthier family relationships based on accurate understanding rather than harmful assumptions. The success had never been about the money. It had been about creating the independence and leverage necessary to demand respect rather than beg for acceptance. As the city skyline came into view, dotted with properties that generated wealth while I lived my life, I realized that the most valuable thing I'd built wasn't a business empire. It was the unshakable knowledge that my worth didn't depend on other people's opinions or approval. That confidence had made everything else possible, and it would continue to serve me regardless of what family relationships looked like going forward. The girl who had been excluded from family gatherings 3 years ago was gone, replaced by a woman who chose her relationships based on love and respect, rather than need or obligation. Patricia's rejection had been intended as a lesson about knowing my place, but it had taught me something completely different, that my place was wherever I chose to make it, and that true success meant never again needing permission to belong. The following weeks transformed our family dynamics in ways that felt both revolutionary and surprisingly natural. Dad called me every Tuesday morning to discuss potential investment opportunities, seeking my perspective on deals that would have once been handled entirely within his inner circle. Patricia began including me in holiday planning conversations, her tone noticeably different. Respectful rather than condescending, curious about my schedule rather than assuming my availability. The most meaningful change came during our first family dinner after the revelation. Instead of sitting quietly while others discussed business ventures I supposedly couldn't understand, I found myself at the center of strategic conversations about market trends and development opportunities. Jennifer asked detailed questions about my consulting methodology, genuinely interested in applying some of my client transformation techniques to her own marketing career. Maya, I've been thinking about what you said regarding independence versus isolation, she said over dessert. I realize I've been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder that I haven't developed any backup plans or alternative revenue streams. Could you walk me through how you identified your first investment properties? The question opened a 2-hour conversation about financial strategy, risk assessment, and building multiple income sources. David joined in, sharing his own investment goals and asking for advice about property markets in his area. For the first time in years, I felt like a valued family member whose expertise was genuinely appreciated rather than someone whose presence was merely tolerated. Patricia listened to these conversations with an expression that mixed fascination with what looked like genuine regret. During a quiet moment in the kitchen, she approached me with unusual vulnerability. Maya, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an acknowledgement that I was threatened by your independence, even when I thought you were struggling. There was something about your confidence that made me uncomfortable. And I realize now that I was trying to diminish that confidence rather than understand it. The admission surprised me with its honesty. Patricia, what made you feel threatened? You never seemed to need our approval the way other people did. Even when you were facing financial challenges, you maintained this inner strength that I couldn't break down or manipulate. It frustrated me because I couldn't figure out how to make you dependent on family validation. Her self-awareness was remarkable and slightly disturbing. You wanted me to be dependent on family validation? I wanted everyone to be dependent on family validation because it gave me control over family dynamics. But you were always just yourself, regardless of circumstances. It made you unpredictable and therefore threatening to the social order I was trying to maintain. The key conversation provided insight into Patricia's motivations that I hadn't expected. Her exclusion of me hadn't been entirely about embarrassment over my financial situation. It had been about her inability to control someone who derived self-worth from internal rather than external sources. The irony, I replied, is that your attempts to exclude me actually strengthened that independence. Every time you suggested I didn't belong, you reinforced my determination to build something that belonged entirely to me. I created the very thing I was trying to prevent, she acknowledged. Your complete independence from family opinion or approval. But that independence actually makes me a better family member, not a worse one. I'm here because I choose to be, not because I need to be. That makes relationships stronger, not weaker. 3 months after the revelation, Dad proposed something that would have been unthinkable during the years of my exclusion. A formal business partnership between Rodriguez Development and Rodriguez Holdings. The proposal involved combining his development expertise with my capital and property portfolio to pursue larger, more ambitious projects than either of us could handle independently. Maya, I've been thinking about legacy, he said during one of our Tuesday morning calls. Not just financial legacy, but the kind of impact we can have on communities through thoughtful development. Your investment strategy has always been about improving neighborhoods rather than just extracting profit. I'd like to build something together that reflects those values. The proposal excited me not just because of its business potential, but because it represented the kind of father-daughter collaboration I'd always hoped might be possible. We spent weeks developing a partnership structure that combined our complementary strengths while maintaining the independence that had become so important to my sense of identity. Jennifer surprised me by asking if I'd consider mentoring her, transition from corporate marketing to independent consulting. I've been watching how you built your business, and I realize I want that kind of professional autonomy. Not necessarily real estate investing, but the ability to create value on my own terms rather than climbing someone else's ladder. Working with Jennifer provided unexpected insight into family dynamics and the ways my success had influenced. Everyone's thinking about career and financial strategy. She was intelligent and capable, but had been conditioned to seek advancement through traditional employment rather than entrepreneurship. "The most valuable thing you can teach me," she said during one of our consulting sessions, "isn't specific business techniques. It's the mindset that makes independence possible, the confidence to bet on yourself rather than waiting for other people to validate your worth." Her observation captured something essential about the transformation I'd undergone during my years of family exclusion. The skills and strategies had been important, but the underlying shift in self-perception had been crucial. Learning to value my own judgment over other people's opinions had been the foundation for everything else. David approached me about partnering on a real estate investment fund targeted at young professionals who wanted to build wealth but lacked the capital for individual property purchases. His financial background combined with my investment track record could create opportunities for people facing the same challenges I'd once navigated. "What I find inspiring about your story," he said, "isn't just that you became successful despite family rejection. It's that you maintained your values and relationships while building something extraordinary. Most people become bitter or isolated when they feel unappreciated." "Bitterness would have been easier in some ways," I admitted, "but it would have limited my growth. Using rejection as motivation was more productive than using it as an excuse." The conversation led to discussions about resilience, emotional intelligence, and the ways adversity can either strengthen or diminish character depending on how it's processed. David was developing his own theories about success and failure, based on observing family dynamics and business relationships. 6 months after the conference room revelation, our family gathered for Dad's 71st birthday. A celebration that felt completely different from the previous year's event. Instead of being tolerated as someone who couldn't afford to participate meaningfully, I was included as a valued partner in planning and hosting. More importantly, the conversation throughout the evening reflected genuine curiosity about each other's lives and accomplishments, rather than performative displays of social status. "Looking around this room," Dad said during his birthday toast, "I'm struck by how much stronger our family has become through honest communication about who we really are, rather than who we think we should be." Maya taught us that assumptions about people's circumstances often reveal more about our limitations than theirs. As the evening concluded, Patricia pulled me aside one final time. "Maya, I want you to know that having you fully present in family conversations has made me realize how much richness we missed during those years when I was trying to protect everyone from imaginary problems. The richness was always there, Patricia. The difference is that now you're curious about it rather than threatened by it. I've learned something important from watching your journey," she continued. "Real strength comes from building something meaningful rather than tearing down other people's confidence. I spent too much energy trying to diminish others instead of developing myself." Her recognition felt genuine and complete, representing the kind of personal growth that makes relationships sustainable over time. The woman who had once suggested I should avoid family gatherings until my finances improved had evolved into someone who appreciated strength and independence rather than feeling threatened by them. Driving home that night, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought our family to this point. The rejection that had felt so devastating 3 years earlier had been transformed into the foundation for healthier relationships based on mutual respect rather than conditional acceptance. The success I'd built hadn't been about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It had been about creating the independence necessary to choose relationships based on love rather than need. That choice had made all the difference, allowing me to engage with family from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad. "Thank you for showing us what it looks like to turn rejection into rocket fuel. Your example has inspired changes in all of us that go far beyond business or money." As I parked in front of my building, surrounded by properties that generated wealth while I lived my life, I realized that the most valuable thing I'd built wasn't a business empire. It was the unshakable knowledge that my worth didn't depend on other people's recognition or approval. That confidence had made everything else possible: the financial success, the family reconciliation, and most importantly, the ability to love people without needing them to validate my existence. The girl who had been excluded from family gatherings was gone, replaced by a woman who chose her relationships consciously and engaged with them authentically. Patricia's rejection had been intended as a lesson about knowing my place, but it had taught me something far more valuable: that my place was wherever I decided to build it, and that true success meant never again needing permission to belong anywhere, especially in my own family. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's becoming so completely yourself that other people's opinions become irrelevant to your happiness and success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.